Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Mayor Brown's video series, At the Crossroads, CFTC and DOJ Enforcement. My name is Matt Kluchenik, a partner in Mayor Brown's Litigation and Dispute Resolution Group, and I'm joined today by my partner, Glenn Kopp, also a member of the Litigation Dispute Resolution Group, as well as the White Collar Defense Team. So every couple of weeks, as you may know, our goal is to bring to you an interesting and timely topic that regards the intersection of CFTC and DOJ enforcement. Today, we thought we would cover something a little bit more basic, perhaps more of a primer, but something that we believe is really useful for practitioners in the space and particularly in-house counsels. And that would be the CFTC Enforcement Manual and the Justice Manual, the role and purposes of these particular documents. Each of them are lengthy. Each actually includes a treasure trove of information, and we thought it'd be helpful and useful just to touch on some of the key things addressed in these manuals. So with that, Glenn, let me turn it over to you. Any initial thoughts, comments, or questions?
Sure, Matt. I guess first initial thought, and then a question or two. I guess initial thought is that I think the in-house counsel should be, I think, comforted by the fact that the Department of Justice actually makes its guidance for prosecutors, its policies, available online. So it is not something that only the prosecutors in the department have access to. You called it the Justice Manual. That is a recent change. When back in my day, we called it the USAM, or the U.S. Attorney's Manual. The Department of Justice a few years ago recognized or acknowledged that that's a more narrow scope than the manual actually covers. It covers all prosecutors, including inmate justice. And so I think it's a good resource for in-house counsel to orient themselves in terms of how to build compliance programs, what to expect if they are ever going to engage with the department, especially from the way the department views corporate defendants. And that's a big piece of what we talk about. It's a big piece of our practice, and it's obviously in-house counsel's a main concern. And along with a lot of other valuable information about the relevant criminal statutes and some history, the department tries to lay out as clear as possible in this document, in the manual, how they approach prosecutions and considerations for prosecutions of corporate defendants. For you, Matt, from the CFTC perspective, could you give us a little bit of sort of history of the manual for the CFTC enforcement team, and how is it used?
Sure. And interestingly, the CFTC's enforcement manual was not made public until only about 3 years ago in 2019. So prior to that time, those of us not in the agency had no access to it. So it was a great move to release it. It's available online on the CFTC's website, or just Google it. Very easy to find. And it's fairly in-depth and covers a lot of topics. It's about 52 pages long, last time I checked. And some of the stuff is really basic, but again, if you're not a practitioner, regularly dealing in the space, learning about things like the life cycle of investigations, where leads, where tips can come from. There's a number of substantive issues addressed, such as the invocation of the Fifth Amendment and CFTC enforcement's views with respect to that. As well as items such as assertion of the attorney-client privilege and waiver consideration. So important stuff from a policy perspective, but there's also a lot of kind of, what I would call, maybe not as important, but still important technical items. Things like, when are you entitled to receive a transcript? Issues around the Wells process, expectations. There's some requirements set forth, submitting a white paper, so on and so forth. So again, really just a treasure trove of information. And for those who are not regularly practicing in the space and want to get familiar or become more familiar, it's both of these are really good resources to go to. So Glenn, question back to you. I mean, is the Justice Manual, is it like updated on an annual basis or ad hoc, or can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Sure, Matt. I think ad hoc is maybe being generous. I think there have been some recent efforts to update it more regularly, as a big overhaul was in 2017, 2018, when they actually made the name change and did an overall review as required, as ordered by leadership of Main Justice, an overall review of the manual, which really hadn't been overhauled on a big basis, on a significant basis in 20 years or so. And there are updates that can come every couple of years in particular sections that may have major Supreme Court decisions that impact elements of crimes or impact how justice approaches prosecution. And so that can happen. But the problem is that layered on top of the manual, you would have guidance issued by justice. And that would not get incorporated necessarily into the manual because it didn't rise to the level of being needed, or justice just wasn't focused on updating the document. And there was some concern that you did not have consistent approach across the Justice Department, various U.S. attorneys' offices approaching certain key issues differently, and that consistency is important. That's sort of a main role of Main Justice, is maintaining a consistent approach to prosecutions across the country. And so the focus has been over the last couple of years to try to limit extraneous guidance, so to speak, and focus on policy pronouncements that then get incorporated into the document. And as recently as I think it was, we talked in the fall of 2021 about some major policy changes announced by the department in terms of how they prosecute corporations, including the cooperation credit and internal investigations. And those updates will ultimately be incorporated into the manual. And it'll be clear, at least the latest update, the date of the latest update in the manual. That hasn't happened yet as of this morning when I checked. And another issue that I think is important is that the manual doesn't show you the history. So when changes are made, you can't redline. It doesn't show you red lines, right? Which would be nice. And I think corporations themselves often try to keep, and our advice is often keep iterative document. I keep a history of your policies and procedures, so you know where you came and you can explain why you made those changes. Justice hasn't done that as well, I think. So that's sort of a short history of sort of how things change and when they change. What about from the CFTC end, Matt?
So periodically as well, but really good point, Glenn. In terms of emphasizing, and particularly with respect to the CFTC manual, which is much, much shorter than the Justice Manual, is that it's a starting point, and it's not comprehensive. It's never going to be as current as everything that's out there. And so while the manual will touch on, for example, things like cooperation, things like civil monetary penalty guidance, so on and so forth, and sanctions more generally, you've got to look at the actual advisories, guidance issued by enforcement, and review that stuff in tandem with the manual, because the manual just isn't as comprehensive. And in that respect, or in those respects. So again, looking at the full spectrum is really, really important, and keeping in mind it's a starting point. So Glenn, any other key takeaways aside from our general recommendation? If one of these types of matters pops up, go to the manuals, get familiar with those manuals.
No, Matt, I would only add and reinforce what you said before, which is it's not the only source, but it's a great start. And make sure that you not only are focused on more recent updates that might not yet have been incorporated, but make sure you're focused on the law in your district, because some of the citations, because the Justice Manual does refer to sort of case law, they're not necessarily going to be the leading case in your district or in your circuit. So just keep that in mind, but don't ignore it. An incredibly helpful base of information.
Couldn't agree more. Super. Thanks, Glenn. Thanks everyone for watching this episode of At the Crossroads, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.